The year was 1325. A young man from Tangier, barely 21 years old, left his mother in tears at the city gates. His name was Ibn Battuta, and by the time he died, he had crossed more territory than Marco Polo, Zheng He, and Herodotus combined. If you've ever felt that the history you were taught leaves whole continents out of the picture, you already suspect where this is going. The world before airplanes was not flat, it was not slow, it was not disconnected, and one man's footsteps across 3 decades prove that the global traveler existed centuries before the age of exploration. But his name is rarely taught outside the Islamic world, and that silence is itself part of the story. In 1325, the Moroccan Marinid Sultanate was a crossroads of trade and scholarship. Fez, where Ibn Battuta trained as a jurist, was a city of libraries and caravans, its streets smelling of leather from the tanneries and saffron from the markets. He left for Mecca on the Hajj, a pilgrimage that would have been a lifetime achievement for any other man. For Ibn Battuta, it was a starting point. The standard narrative says that long-distance travel in the Middle Ages was rare, dangerous, and limited to merchants or crusaders. That is what many believe. But Ibn Battuta's itinerary, spanning over 75,000 miles, contradicts every assumption. He did not journey as a conquistador or a merchant prince. He traveled as a scholar, a jurist, a guest. And his observations, recorded decades later in a book called the Rihla, form a layer of evidence that upends the entire Western-centric model of pre-modern exploration. Consider this. Marco Polo traveled roughly 15,000 miles. Ibn Battuta traveled 5 times that distance. Polo was a merchant's emissary. Ibn Battuta was a wandering judge who served sultans from Delhi to Mali. He visited the court of the Byzantine emperor. He sailed the Indus River on a cargo boat, made of planks sewn together with coconut fiber. He walked through the forests of Sumatra and dined with the king of Ternate, an island in the remote spice trade of the Indonesian archipelago. And he did all this while carrying a single conviction, that the Islamic world was a single connected civilization, and that its borders were far larger than any map drawn in Europe. This is the kind of fact that rewires the map in your head. If it lands with you the way it lands with us, you might want to subscribe, because this channel exists to find these forgotten lines of connection and pull them into the light. And I'd like to know, what moment in your own education made you suspect that the story you were handed was incomplete? Drop that in the comments. I want to see where your journey started. You might think this sounds like a legend. The number of places he claims to have visited, over 40 modern countries, seems improbable. But the evidence is anchored in specific dates, named patrons, and verifiable events. In 1326, he was in Cairo. In 1331, he was in Kilwa on the coast of modern Tanzania, describing the coral stone architecture of a thriving Swahili city-state. In 1341, he was in Delhi, serving Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq as a judge. And in 1352, he was in the city of Sijil Massa, returning to Morocco after nearly 30 years. The Rihla, dictated to a Moroccan scholar named Ibn Juzai in 1355, contains over 400 named individuals, governors, scholars, rulers, many of whom can be independently verified from other historical records. When Ibn Battuta describes the Zaytuna Mosque in Tunis or the bustling markets of Damascus, the details match archaeological and textual evidence. This is not fantasy. This is testimony. If you've ever suspected that the global story of human movement has been narrowed to fit a single cultural lens, you know the discomfort of watching a puzzle piece missing from the table. Ibn Battuta is that missing piece, and his journey reveals a forgotten principle, that the medieval world was already connected by a deep infrastructure of faith, law, and trade. A system that enabled a single man to cross deserts and oceans without ever leaving the boundaries of a civilization he recognized as his own. But that was about to change, because the longer Ibn Battuta traveled, the more he began to notice something that disturbed him, and that something, when he finally recorded it, would challenge the very idea of unity within the Islamic world. What he saw in the margins, the cracks between empires, the forgotten factions, the people who lived beyond the reach of any sultan, would reveal that the map he carried in his head was not complete. In 1332, Ibn Battuta arrived in the city of Ajmer, in northern India. He had just crossed the Hindu Kush Mountains, a journey that killed most of his traveling companions. He writes about the cold, the snow, the exhaustion. But when he reaches the city, he describes something else entirely: the coexistence of Muslims, Hindus, Jains, and a community of fire worshippers he identifies as descendants of Zoroastrian refugees. The city's markets sold textiles from Persia, spices from the Malabar coast, and iron tools from China. And in the center of the city stood a mosque built atop a former temple, a visible scar of conquest, but also a sign of the layered past that no single narrative could contain. The disruption here is not simply that Ibn Battuta traveled far. It is that his entire framework for understanding the world, a unified Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam, was being tested by the reality he encountered. The people he met did not always see themselves as part of a single community. They spoke different languages, followed different legal traditions, and sometimes resisted the authority of the sultans who employed him. This is where the forgetting begins. Look at the evidence. In 1342, when Ibn Battuta visited the Maldives, he was appointed a judge by the local sultan. He describes the islands as a paradise of coconut palms and pearl fisheries. But he also records, with visible frustration, that the women of the islands wore minimal clothing, and that the legal system did not follow the strict Maliki school he had studied in Fez. He tried to impose reform. He failed. The local population preferred their own customs, which had been shaped by centuries of Indian Ocean trade, not by the scholars of Morocco or Cairo. This moment, a judge from Tangier arriving on an Indian Ocean island and trying to enforce a legal code that did not fit, encapsulates the tension at the heart of Ibn Battuta's journey. He was a traveler of immense curiosity, but he was also a product of a specific tradition. And that tradition, he slowly realized, did not cover everything. This tension between a traveler's framework and the stubborn reality of local life is the thread that runs through every civilization. If you feel the pull of these deeper histories, subscribe to continue walking alongside us as we trace the hidden currents that shaped our world. And tell me in the comments, have you ever encountered a local custom that forced you to question a belief you thought was universal? That's the kind of story that connects us. At this point, you might be thinking, so what? One man's journey, however long, does not rewrite global history. But here is where the forgotten principle emerges with full force. Ibn Battuta's travels reveal that the medieval world was integrated not by military conquest or political empire alone, but by an invisible web of legal scholarship, pilgrimage networks, and credit systems that allowed a single traveler to cross borders without a passport. The same system that enabled him to serve as a judge in Delhi allowed him to draw funds in Cairo and repay them in Sumatra. This was the backbone of a global civilization that historians have called the Islamic cosmopolis, a world held together not by a single ruler, but by a shared legal tradition and a pilgrimage that drew millions of people to Mecca every year. Now consider this from the perspective of scale. In the year 1300, the population of Cairo was roughly 400,000, larger than any city in Europe except perhaps Constantinople. The library of the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus held vast collections of manuscripts. The University of Al-Qarawiyyin in Fez, founded in 859, was already 5 centuries old when Ibn Battuta studied there. This was not a civilization on the periphery. It was the center of a global network that extended from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And yet, when you ask most people today to name the greatest traveler of the pre-modern world, they say Marco Polo. The reason is not evidence, it is narrative. Polo's story was written by a romance writer in a French prison. Ibn Battuta's story was dictated to a court scholar at the request of a sultan. One became a legend. The other remained a reference text, and the difference between them is the difference between a story shaped for European courts and a testimony preserved for a civilization that was already beginning to fragment. But before we follow Ibn Battuta into the Mali desert, I want to offer you a choice if you want to keep uncovering stories like this, the ones that rewrite the map you were given. Subscribe to this channel and leave a comment naming one other forgotten traveler from any culture you think deserves more recognition. Then, right after you do that, pause here with me. The narrator is about to ask you something important. In the next section, we will follow Ibn Battuta into the sub-Saharan desert, where he will meet a ruler whose wealth in gold would dwarf the treasuries of Europe. And we will discover that the journey itself was the message, that the act of crossing so many borders was itself a political statement, one that the modern world has only begun to understand. But first, pause here. If the distance between what you were taught and what the evidence shows feels personal, tell me in the comments. Where did you first suspect the story was incomplete? That is where the reinvention begins. The year was 1352, and Ibn Battuta was finally home. He had been gone for 27 years. He had walked through snowstorms in the Hindu Kush, sailed through monsoons on the Indian Ocean, and crossed the Sahara on a camel that carried nothing but water and salt. He returned to Fez with a beard turned white and a memory that held a library of worlds. But when he sat down to dictate his story, he did something unexpected. He did not boast. He described the flaws. One of those flaws sits in the margins of the Rihla, almost invisible to a casual reader. In a passage about the city of Tlemcen, Ibn Battuta records that he was robbed by a group of Berber nomads who took his clothes and left him in the desert wearing only a loincloth. He does not name them. He does not curse them. He simply notes the event as though it were a weather report. The silence around that moment is louder than the event itself, because Ibn Battuta, a man who crossed the entire known world, chose not to record the faces of the people who took everything from him. The omission is a choice, and that choice tells us more about his world than any inventory of gold or conquest. Think about what this means. The Rihla is not a neutral document. It is a curated testimony, filtered through memory, politics, and the expectations of a patron who wanted to see the Islamic world rendered as a unified civilization. Ibn Battuta and his ghostwriter Ibn Juzai shaped the manuscript to fit a particular image. They emphasized hospitality because it proved the unity of Dar al-Islam. They downplayed violence between Muslims because it contradicted that vision. And they left out entire regions, entire peoples, who did not fit the framework. The result is a masterpiece of observation and a masterpiece of omission. But here is what remains after you strip away the editing. The evidence of connection is overwhelming. Ibn Battuta traveled along a network of roads, sea routes, and caravanserais that had been operating for centuries. He found judges, scholars, and hostels waiting for him in cities from Mogadishu to Samarkand. He drew funds using a system of credit called the Suftaja, which allowed merchants and scholars to transfer money across continents without physically moving coins. This was the infrastructure of a global civilization. And it worked because a shared legal tradition made strangers trustworthy. In 1353, after the Rihla was completed, Ibn Battuta was appointed a judge in a small Moroccan town. He died in 1369, probably in Fez, and was buried in an unmarked grave. The exact location is unknown. The man who had walked 75,000 miles to serve justice across the world ended his life in anonymity. The scholar who had dined with sultans and debated with philosophers was forgotten by all but a handful of local chroniclers. And that, in a strange way, is the final proof of his story. Because the system he traveled within, the Islamic cosmopolis, did not need him to be remembered. It needed him to have been there. And he was. He was in Cairo when the plague struck. He was in Delhi when the Sultan built a minaret intended to be the tallest in the world. He was in Mali when a king named Mansa Musa was still alive, the same king whose pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 caused inflation in Cairo by distributing so much gold. Ibn Battuta saw the edges of these worlds, wrote them down, and then stepped back into the anonymity from which he came. The forgotten principle that his journey reveals is this: the medieval world was not a collection of isolated islands separated by vast distances. It was a web, and the web did not need a single hero. It needed travelers, judges, pilgrims, merchants, ordinary people who moved along invisible lines that connected everything. Ibn Battuta was one of those people. He was not exceptional because he was unique. He was exceptional because he was typical of a civilization that produced thousands of travelers like him, most of whose names we will never know. So when you ask yourself what the real story of global migration and connection looks like, the answer is not found in the galleons of Columbus or the ships of Zheng He. It is found in the worn souls of a Moroccan judge who left his mother crying at the city gate and returned, decades later, to sit in a quiet room and dictate the names of cities that no longer exist, scholars whose books are lost, and kings whose gold has long since been spent. And of everything he wrote, the most important sentence is not about power or wealth or discovery. It is about a moment in the Maldives when a local woman looked at the judge from Tangier and simply refused to change. Her name is lost. Her voice is unwritten. But her presence in the margins of the Rihla proves what Ibn Battuta could not bring himself to say outright: that even within the greatest network of connection the world had ever seen, the real center was never the traveler. It was always the people who stayed home.